The cottage had never gone dark before midnight, not once in 7 years. Rowan Blackwood reined in his horse at the crest of the narrow forest trail, his gloved hand tightening around the leather reins as his eyes searched the familiar clearing below. Every journey home from the capital ended the same way. Long before the royal towers disappeared behind the pines, before the last patrol saluted and turned back toward the fortress, one warm amber light always greeted him from the little stone cottage nestled beneath the ancient oaks. It had become so ordinary that he had stopped noticing it years ago, just as people stopped noticing the stars that returned every night. But tonight, the window was black. No golden glow spilled across the garden path. No lantern swayed gently beneath the porch roof. Even the small herb boxes lining the windowsill disappeared into the darkness, as though the cottage itself had quietly vanished from the world. Rowan frowned, urging his horse forward. The cool autumn air smelled of damp pine needles and the promise of rain. Somewhere deeper in the woods, an owl called into the silence, but the familiar comfort he usually felt whenever he approached Elara Bennett's home refused to come. The quiet was wrong. It pressed against him with an unfamiliar weight that made his chest tighten for reasons he couldn't explain. Elara always left the lamp burning. Always. Whether he arrived before sunset or long after midnight. Whether he came wounded after a border patrol or exhausted from endless council meetings, she somehow knew exactly when to place another log on the fire and another kettle over the stove. She never asked how long he would stay. She never complained when duty called him away before dawn. Somehow, she was simply there, waiting. Rowan had never questioned it. He had simply believed it was one of the few things in his life that never changed. His horse slowed on its own as they reached the front gate. The little vegetable garden rested untouched beneath the pale moonlight. Rosemary bushes released their soft scent into the night breeze. A single wooden rocking chair sat empty on the porch, perfectly still. He dismounted, boots crunching against the gravel path, expecting at any moment to hear the front door creak open and Elara's calm voice greet him with the same quiet smile she always wore. Instead, only silence answered. His gaze drifted toward the small dining table visible through the dark window. Even from outside, he could barely make out two place settings resting beneath the faint silver glow of the moon. Something inside him shifted. 2 plates. She had expected company. His hand reached for the door before stopping inches from the handle. For years she had insisted he never needed to knock. "You're always welcome here," she had once told him with an embarrassed little laugh as she tucked a loose strand of chestnut hair behind one ear. He remembered smiling without really hearing the words. Tonight, for reasons he couldn't name, he hesitated. Then his eyes caught something resting on the top porch step. A small iron key glimmered beneath a thin layer of rainwater left by the afternoon shower. He recognized it instantly. It was the spare key Elara had pressed into his hand 6 winters ago after he had arrived soaked from a snowstorm. "In case I'm gathering herbs when you come," she had said. He had carried it ever since, though he had almost never needed it. Now it lay outside, carefully placed where he could not possibly miss it. Rowan bent down slowly, lifting the cold metal into his palm. It felt strangely heavier than he remembered. His heartbeat echoed louder than the wind rustling through the trees. She hadn't forgotten it. She had returned it. A faint uneasiness settled deep inside him, but he quickly pushed it aside. Perhaps she had gone to the village. Perhaps a patient needed her help. Perhaps she would be back before the rain started again. Elara always came back. She always waited. Rowan slipped the key into his pocket, still convincing himself that nothing had truly changed, never realizing that only 6 hours earlier, inside this very cottage, the last candle had burned to the bottom of its glass while the woman who had spent years waiting for him quietly decided she would wait no longer. 6 hours earlier, the cottage had been filled with the gentle rhythm of ordinary hope. Elara Bennett folded a linen towel over the basket of fresh bread she had baked before sunrise, smiling to herself as she placed it beside a steaming bowl of vegetable stew. The scent of rosemary, thyme, and slow-cooked onions drifted through the little kitchen, wrapping every corner of the house in quiet warmth. Outside, the last colors of autumn glowed beneath the setting sun, turning the tops of the oak trees into ribbons of amber and gold. She glanced toward the clock resting above the fireplace. Rowan had promised he would arrive before supper. Not after the council meeting. Not whenever duty allowed. before supper. The difference seemed small to anyone else, but to Elara it felt precious. For the first time in months, he had made a promise without adding conditions. She reached for 2 ceramic bowls, carefully setting them across from one another on the weathered oak table. The second bowl always looked a little newer because it spent far less time being used. Even so, she polished it with the same care every time. The chair across from hers remained perfectly straight, exactly where she imagined Rowan would pull it back before sitting down with the tired sigh he never allowed anyone else to hear. She could almost picture him loosening the heavy cloak from his shoulders, rubbing the bridge of his nose after another endless day surrounded by advisors who demanded pieces of him until there was almost nothing left. Those evenings had always been enough for her. They should not have been, but somehow they were. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Old Mrs. Parker from the neighboring farm stood on the porch holding a basket of fresh apples. "I saw your chimney smoking," the elderly woman said with a knowing smile. "Special occasion?" Elara hesitated only for a heartbeat before nodding. He promised he would come for supper. Mrs. Parker's eyes softened with quiet kindness. "Then I hope tonight is different." Elara laughed gently, pretending not to notice the careful choice of words. "It will be." The older woman squeezed her hand before walking back toward the dirt road, leaving Elara standing on the porch long after the footsteps faded into the evening breeze. She returned inside and straightened the tablecloth one more time. Everything already looked perfect, yet she kept finding little tasks that needed doing. She arranged the flowers in a small glass jar. She swept away a few leaves that had blown through the open doorway. She checked the kettle twice, then opened the oven simply to keep the bread warm. The minutes slipped quietly past. The first stars appeared above the trees. She lit the porch lantern as she always did, watching the golden light spread across the front steps. Travelers often joked that they could find their way through the forest simply by following the little lamp outside Elara's cottage. Rowan had once smiled when he heard that story. "It is difficult to lose your way when someone leaves a light on for you," he had said absent-mindedly while reading one of his reports. She had treasured the sentence for years, even though he probably never remembered saying it. Another hour passed. The stew cooled. She reheated it slowly, stirring the pot without taking her eyes from the window. Every distant hoofbeat made her heart lift before sinking again into silence. She never blamed him immediately. There was always another explanation. An unexpected meeting. A messenger from the southern border. A dispute between neighboring packs. A sick child needing the king's attention. Rowan carried an entire kingdom across his shoulders. Surely she could carry one more hour. She looked once more at the little calendar hanging beside the pantry. Tiny pencil marks filled nearly every month. Most people would have seen nothing but ordinary dates. Elara saw canceled dinners, delayed walks through the woods, birthdays shortened by emergencies, and quiet evenings that had never happened. She traced one fingertip across today's square before lowering her hand. Her smile remained, but it felt heavier now, as though she were holding it in place instead of wearing it naturally. The candle at the center of the table burned lower, wax slowly spilling down its sides. Outside, the porch lantern continued shining faithfully into the growing darkness, waiting for footsteps that still had not come. The second hand of the little clock continued its patient circle while the candle in the middle of the table grew shorter and the stew slowly lost the rich aroma that had filled the cottage only an hour before. Elara stood by the window with her arms folded loosely across her sweater, watching the narrow trail disappear into the darkening forest. Every few minutes, she thought she heard hoofbeats, only to realize it was nothing more than the wind moving through the branches. She smiled at herself, embarrassed by how easily hope could imitate certainty. Rowan had never asked her to wait this way. That was the truth she repeated whenever disappointment crept too close. He had never demanded that she keep supper warm or leave the porch lantern glowing until midnight. Those had been choices she made because somewhere along the years she had convinced herself that love was measured by quiet patience. She crossed the room and gently lifted the lid from the pot again, stirring the stew just enough to keep it from settling. Steam rose for only a moment before fading into the cool evening air. Beside the stove hung Rowan's old riding cloak, the one he had forgotten during a spring storm almost 4 years earlier. She had washed it, repaired the torn seam near the shoulder, and kept meaning to return it. Somehow another visit always came before she remembered, and eventually the cloak had become part of the cottage itself, as familiar as the shelves filled with dried herbs or the rocking chair beside the fireplace. Her eyes wandered to the bookshelf where a wooden wolf Rowan had carved with his pocket knife rested beside a collection of medical journals. He had made it during one unusually peaceful afternoon while waiting for medicine to finish brewing. The carving was rough, one ear slightly crooked, and completely unlike the polished gifts displayed inside the royal palace. Yet she had treasured it more than anything expensive because he had laughed while making it. She could still hear that rare laugh whenever she looked at the little figure. It reminded her that somewhere beneath the weight of the crown lived the man she had fallen in love with. The problem was not that Rowan never cared. The problem was that caring always arrived after everything else. The kingdom came first. The council came first. The patrols, the harvest reports, the trade disputes, the visiting delegates, the endless stack of responsibilities all found places ahead of moments that belonged only to them. She had accepted that order for so long she no longer questioned it. Tonight, however, something inside her refused to invent another excuse before he had even offered one. She walked toward the pantry and opened a small wooden drawer where she kept letters tied neatly with a faded blue ribbon. None of them were love letters. Rowan was not a man who wrote about feelings. Most were brief notes delivered by palace messengers. Running late. Border inspection delayed. Council meeting extended. Rain washed out the eastern road. Each message had once comforted her because at least he had remembered to send them. Then the notes became less frequent. Eventually, they disappeared altogether, replaced by silence she translated on his behalf. She untied the ribbon and slowly counted them. There were only 11 letters spanning 7 years. 11 explanations for hundreds of evenings. She placed them back inside the drawer with extraordinary care before closing it. The realization settled gently rather than painfully. She had been doing half of every conversation alone. Outside, the porch lantern continued glowing with steady determination, welcoming someone who had not yet chosen to come home. Elara rested one hand against the cool window glass and looked toward the empty trail once more. She whispered, almost too softly to hear herself, "I hope you are safe." Even now, concern reached her before disappointment. That was what frightened her most. Not that Rowan might never arrive tonight, but that she had slowly forgotten how to ask whether her own heart had been arriving anywhere at all. The candle flickered as a draft slipped beneath the front door, and for the first time in years, she did not move immediately to shield the flame. The room had grown so quiet that Elara could hear the tiny crackle of the candle as it consumed the last of its wick. The stew had been warmed twice, the bread wrapped again to keep it soft, and the tea she had prepared for Rowan had long since turned cold inside the blue ceramic pot. She looked once more toward the empty chair across the table, then reached out and gently removed the second bowl before carrying it back to the kitchen. The movement felt strangely unfamiliar, almost as though she were breaking a tradition older than the cottage itself. She did not cry. She did not sigh. She simply accepted what her heart had been trying to tell her for much longer than she wanted to admit. Opening the cupboard beneath the counter, she reached behind several jars of dried lavender and chamomile until her fingers touched a thick cream-colored envelope she had hidden months earlier. A dark green seal stamped with the crest of Haven Ridge remained perfectly intact across the flap. She had received the letter nearly 3 months ago after volunteering at a regional healer gathering. The director of Haven Ridge Healing House had offered her a permanent position, a private cottage, a generous salary, and complete freedom to build her own clinic. It had been everything a healer could dream of. She had folded the letter away without replying. She had convinced herself that Rowan needed her here. Or perhaps, if she allowed herself complete honesty, she had needed to believe he would one day choose her the way she had already chosen him. Slowly, she broke the seal. The familiar words greeted her once again, inviting her to begin before the first frost if she accepted. Beneath the invitation rested a second page and a fountain pen she had placed there weeks ago, telling herself she would answer someday. That someday had always seemed far away. Until tonight. Elara sat at the small writing desk beside the window. Outside, the porch lantern still glowed faithfully over the front steps, casting soft circles of light across the gravel path that remained empty. She dipped the pen into ink and stared at the blank space waiting for her signature. Her hand refused to move at first. Instead, Memories quietly gathered around her like autumn leaves carried by the wind. Rowan standing beside the fireplace with fresh snow melting from his boots. Rowan falling asleep in the rocking chair after 3 sleepless nights protecting the northern border. Rowan laughing over the crooked wooden wolf he had carved with clumsy determination. None of those memories were false. They were real. So was the tenderness she still carried for him. But another truth had slowly grown beside them. Every beautiful memory had happened because she had waited. She had adjusted. She had postponed her own plans until his calendar found room for her. She realized she could remember every promise he had managed to keep because there had been so few of them. That thought settled quietly over her heart, not like anger, but like morning fog revealing a landscape exactly as it had always been. She lowered the pen onto the paper and signed her name in careful script. Elara Bennett. The letters looked surprisingly steady. She folded the acceptance form, slipped it back into the envelope, and placed it beside the front door so she could leave it with the morning courier before sunrise. Her decision did not erase her love. It simply reminded her that love should not require her entire life to remain paused. The clock chimed another hour. Rowan had still not come. She crossed the room and gently touched the little calendar hanging beside the pantry. Today's date remained circled in pale blue pencil. Below it she wrote only 4 words. I finally answered myself. She closed the calendar without another glance. Returning to the dining table, she looked at the untouched place setting waiting across from her. For several long seconds, she simply stood there before carrying the second plate into the kitchen. Then she covered the remaining food, extinguished the candle that had nearly burned itself away, and watched a thin ribbon of smoke curl toward the ceiling. Outside, the lantern continued shining into the darkness, but inside the cottage something had already changed forever, long before the light itself would disappear. For a long time Elara remained beside the front door, her fingers resting lightly on the envelope addressed to Haven Ridge Healing House, as though it might disappear if she looked away. Rain began, tapping softly against the cottage roof, gentle at first, then steadier as the clouds settled over the forest. She stepped outside and lifted the porch lantern from its iron hook. The warm circle of light swayed across the garden she had planted with her mother years before, illuminating neat rows of sage, mint, and lavender that had healed countless strangers and one weary king more times than she could remember. She whispered a quiet goodbye that no one else would ever hear. Then she returned inside and walked slowly from room to room. There was no anger in the way she packed. She folded her clothes with the same careful hands that had once stitched Rowan's torn cloak. She wrapped her mother's worn medical journal in soft linen before placing it inside a leather satchel beside glass bottles of dried herbs and healing salves. The little wooden wolf Rowan had carved remained on the bookshelf. She picked it up, smiled through damp eyes, and almost placed it into her bag before stopping herself. Some memories belonged where they had been made. She set it back exactly where it had always rested. The fire in the hearth had burned low, leaving only glowing embers that painted the room with fading shades of orange. Elara knelt beside the fireplace and added no more wood. For 7 years, she had kept this house ready for unexpected footsteps. Tonight, she chose not to prepare for tomorrow in the same way she had prepared for yesterday. That single decision felt both impossibly small and unimaginably large. She carried her packed bag to the doorway and slipped on her boots. Before opening the door, her eyes fell upon the spare iron key resting inside a ceramic bowl near the entrance. Rowan had insisted she keep the original while he carried the spare, joking once that she would probably lose hers before he ever misplaced his. She remembered laughing because the idea seemed impossible. Carefully she lifted the key, opened the front door, and stepped onto the porch. Rain cooled her cheeks as she bent down and placed the key on the top step where it would be impossible for him to overlook. She did not leave a letter explaining herself. She had spent years explaining without words. If he truly wished to understand, the empty cottage would speak more honestly than any page she could write. She reached up toward the lantern hanging above the porch. The little flame danced behind its glass walls, faithful as always, waiting only for another night of quiet devotion. Her hand paused around the metal handle. Every evening, she had lit this lantern because somewhere inside her heart, she believed that love meant becoming a safe place another person could always return to. She still believed in being a safe place. What she no longer believed was that safety required abandoning herself. Slowly she lowered the lantern from its hook, carried it inside, and placed it upon the kitchen table. The room immediately surrendered to the deep blue shadows of approaching night. Only the dying glow from the fireplace remained. Elara stood perfectly still, allowing herself one last look at the home that had witnessed every hopeful beginning and every silent disappointment. Then she gently breathed across the lantern's flame. Darkness settled over the cottage without resistance. It was neither dramatic nor cruel. It was peaceful. Outside, the forest looked exactly the same, yet everything had changed. The trail leading toward Haven Ridge no longer represented a place she might visit someday. It had become the road she intended to follow before sunrise. She closed the cottage door behind her, locked it, and slipped the key beneath the edge of the porch where the rain could not carry it away. Without looking back a second time, Elara lifted her bag onto her shoulder and walked into the quiet woods. At almost that exact moment, several miles away, Rowan Blackwood finally signed the last document waiting upon his desk. He leaned back with a tired breath and glanced through the palace window toward the dark line of distant trees. A faint smile touched his face. He imagined a warm fire, fresh tea, and the one person who had never failed to leave a light waiting for him. Believing he was only fashionably late, he reached for his cloak and headed toward the stables, completely unaware that the life he expected to find unchanged had already begun moving beyond his reach. Rowan guided his horse through the familiar stretch of forest with the quiet confidence of a man returning to the one place where no ceremony waited for him. The rain had softened into a mist that clung to the pine branches, carrying the clean scent of wet earth through the cool night air. Normally, by the time he reached the final bend in the trail, a warm lantern would already be glowing between the trees, its gentle light cutting through the darkness like a promise that the day was finally over. Tonight there was only shadow. He frowned, leaning forward slightly in the saddle, as if another few feet might reveal the missing light. Perhaps the rain had blown it out, he thought. Elara always remembered little things, but even she could not control the weather. The explanation felt reasonable enough that he continued toward the cottage without allowing the uneasiness in his chest to grow. His horse slowed naturally as they entered the clearing. The windows reflected nothing except the pale moon hidden behind drifting clouds. No smoke curled from the chimney. No soft glow escaped beneath the curtains. Even the flower boxes that usually framed the porch seemed swallowed by darkness. Rowan dismounted, his boots sinking into damp gravel as the silence settled around him. It was a strange silence, not peaceful but absent, as though the cottage itself had stopped breathing. He climbed the porch steps and reached for the door before his eyes caught the small iron key resting carefully on the top step. For a long moment, he simply stared at it. The key should have been inside. She never left it outdoors. Slowly he bent down and picked it up, the cold metal resting heavily against his palm. He recognized every scratch along its worn edge. Years ago she had laughed while pressing it into his hand, insisting that no journey should ever end with him waiting outside her door. He had accepted it without understanding what such trust truly meant. Now the key no longer felt like an invitation. It felt like something gently returned. Rowan slipped it into his pocket almost automatically before knocking once against the wooden door. The sound echoed across the empty clearing. He waited. Nothing. He knocked again, louder this time, listening for the familiar footsteps that never came. Finally, he pushed the door open. The cottage welcomed him with cool darkness instead of warmth. Moonlight spilled through the windows, revealing two bowls still resting on the dining table. One remained untouched. The other had been quietly put away. A candle stood in the center, burned completely to the bottom until only hardened wax surrounded a blackened wick. The scent of herbs lingered faintly in the air, mixed with the memory of a meal prepared hours earlier. Rowan removed his gloves and slowly walked farther inside. Everything looked orderly. Nothing had been abandoned in haste. The blankets were neatly folded. The shelves remained perfectly arranged. The rocking chair sat beside the fireplace exactly where it always had, except the fire itself had long since faded into gray ash. His eyes drifted toward the kitchen, where a covered pot still rested on the stove. He lifted the lid. The stew had cooled into silence. Beside it lay a loaf of bread wrapped carefully in linen to keep it fresh for someone who had never arrived. Rowan lowered the lid again, feeling an unfamiliar weight settle across his shoulders. He had intended to apologize for being late. He had even rehearsed the words while riding through the forest. Now the apology seemed strangely small compared with the quiet evidence surrounding him. He turned toward the writing desk near the window, noticing at once the empty space where several bundles of dried herbs had always waited to be sorted. A leather satchel was gone. So was the old medical journal her mother had treasured. The realization came slowly, one missing object at a time, until it formed a truth he could no longer dismiss. Elara had not stepped out for the evening. She had packed. Rowan stood motionless in the center of the little cottage, surrounded by the ordinary pieces of a life he had somehow believed would remain exactly as he left it. Outside, the rain began falling once more against the roof, and for the first time in many years the Alpha King found himself staring into a darkness that no command, no title, and no crown could force back into light. Rowan remained standing in the middle of the silent cottage long after the rain had become a steady whisper against the roof. The little house had always carried Elara's presence in ways he had never noticed before. A knitted blanket draped neatly across the rocking chair. Bundles of lavender hung from the ceiling beams, filling the cool air with their gentle scent. Small clay pots rested on the windowsill, each holding herbs she patiently tended through every season. Nothing appeared broken. Nothing suggested panic. Instead, every corner reflected deliberate care, as though someone had quietly closed the final page of a well-loved book. He walked toward the bookshelf and reached almost instinctively for the little wooden wolf he had carved years ago. Dust had been carefully wiped from its crooked ears. She had preserved it, even though he had almost forgotten making it. His thumb traced the rough edges of the carving before he placed it exactly where he had found it. His eyes drifted toward the writing desk beside the window. The chair remained tucked neatly underneath. A bottle of ink sat beside several folded papers. Yet one space looked strangely empty, the faint outline of an envelope still visible against the polished wood where sunlight had never reached. He could not explain why that small detail unsettled him more than anything else. It suggested a decision had been made before tonight. This had not begun with his late arrival. He slowly opened one of the desk drawers, expecting little more than dried flowers or spare candles. Instead, he found a narrow calendar no larger than his hand. The cover had faded from years of use. Without thinking, he opened it. Each page contained ordinary dates marked with tiny pencil lines. Some squares carried a single circle. Others had a short note written in neat, careful handwriting. Dinner. Walk after council. Tea. Harvest festival. First snowfall. Rowan frowned. They were memories he barely recognized until he noticed that many of the words had been quietly crossed out. Not with angry strokes, but with one gentle line drawn through each plan. He turned another page. Then, another. The same pattern repeated month after month. A supper delayed. A visit postponed. A picnic moved to another week. A birthday shortened because palace business could not wait. There were no accusations written anywhere. No complaints. No bitter remarks filling the margins. Only dates that had once carried hope before becoming ordinary days again. His chest tightened in a way no battlefield had ever managed. He tried to remember each promise. Some returned immediately. Others remained lost behind years of crowded schedules and endless responsibilities. To him, they had disappeared beneath larger concerns. To Elara, they had been important enough to write down before they vanished. Rowan closed the calendar carefully, almost afraid of damaging it. His gaze wandered across the little room once more. He suddenly noticed something else. The second chair at the dining table had always faced the fireplace. Tonight it had been pushed neatly beneath the table, perfectly aligned with the first. No one was expecting company anymore. He stepped outside onto the porch, drawing a slow breath of cool night air. The rain had eased into a light mist drifting between the trees. Across the clearing the forest looked unchanged, yet the path somehow seemed longer than he remembered. He considered sending riders immediately. One command would have dozens of guards searching every road before dawn. The thought came as naturally as breathing. Just as quickly another thought followed. If she had truly chosen to leave, would ordering people to bring her back change anything that had happened inside this cottage long before tonight? His hand rested unconsciously against the spare key inside his pocket. It no longer felt like something that belonged to him. Behind him, the open doorway framed the quiet room exactly as Elara had left it. Ahead of him stretched the dark trail, disappearing into the woods. Rowan had arrived believing he needed only to apologize for being late. Now, for the first time, he began to wonder whether he had misunderstood the meaning of every journey he had ever made to this little cottage, and whether the answer he was searching for had started years before. Either of them realized it. Rowan did not sleep. Long after midnight, he remained inside the quiet cottage, moving slowly through rooms that suddenly felt larger than he remembered. Every object seemed to ask a question he had never thought to answer. Why had she kept his favorite mug beside the stove, even though he rarely came? Why had she repaired the loose hinge on the front gate without mentioning it? Why had she planted fresh rosemary outside the kitchen window every spring when she knew he always reached for it first whenever she cooked? None of those things had appeared extraordinary while they were happening. Together, they formed a life he had accepted without ever seeing its cost. Dawn still hid beyond the horizon when a faint sound reached him from outside. Wheels. Not the heavy wagons that supplied the palace, but a lighter carriage traveling carefully along the eastern road. Rowan stepped onto the porch just as an older courier pulled a small wagon to a stop near the edge of the clearing. The gray-haired driver removed his hat with quiet respect. "Your Majesty, I did not realize anyone was here." Rowan looked toward the wagon. Only a few empty crates rested inside. "Who are you looking for?" The courier hesitated before answering. "Miss Bennet. I was supposed to collect her acceptance letter before sunrise. We have been waiting nearly 3 months." Rowan felt the words settle like cold rain. "Acceptance letter?" The man nodded. "Havenridge Healing House. They offered her a permanent position. Finest healer they have recruited in years," they said. They almost gave up after she never replied. Yesterday, a messenger returned with word that she had finally accepted. Rowan stared at him without speaking. 3 months. 3 months she had carried a future in silence, while he continued believing nothing would ever change. "Do you know where she is now?" he asked quietly. "Not exactly," the courier admitted. "The transport caravan leaves from Miller's Crossing at first light. If she intends to travel with us, she will meet there." He reached into his coat and produced a folded receipt. "She left this with the village postmaster late yesterday afternoon. In case I arrived before she did." Rowan accepted the small paper. Across the bottom appeared Elara's familiar handwriting confirming her acceptance at Havenridge. There were no personal words, only her name and the date. Simple. Final. The courier climbed back onto his wagon, offering one last sympathetic glance before disappearing down the road. Rowan remained alone on the porch, the receipt trembling slightly between his fingers. The truth finally stood before him in complete clarity. She had not left because of one missed supper. She had begun leaving long before tonight. Every delayed promise, every interrupted evening, every visit shortened by duty had quietly built the road now stretching toward Havenridge. His late arrival had not broken her heart. It had arrived after it was already exhausted. He closed his eyes, remembering the calendar filled with crossed-out plans, the untouched second bowl, the carefully returned key. None of them had been punishment. They had been farewell. For one dangerous moment, instinct urged him toward the simplest solution. He could order the palace guards to close every eastern road before sunrise. He could command every checkpoint to stop the Havenridge caravan. No traveler crossed his territory without his permission. The authority belonged to him. His hand tightened around the folded receipt. Then another memory surfaced. Elara laughing as she handed him fresh bread after saying softly, "Kindness only matters when people are free to refuse it." If he stopped her now, he would prove she had been right to leave. Yet if he did nothing, the distance between them would become measured not in miles, but in choices left unchanged. Rowan looked toward the pale line of dawn beginning to brighten beyond the trees. Miller's Crossing lay less than 20 miles away. The caravan would depart as the first sunlight touched the eastern hills. He folded the receipt carefully and slipped it inside his coat. This journey could no longer be about bringing Elara home. If that was still his goal, he had already lost her. Whatever happened next would demand something far more difficult than the authority of an alpha king. It would require him to become a man she might one day choose to trust again before the road carried her beyond the reach of every promise he had ever failed to keep. The eastern sky had only begun to soften into shades of pale gray when Rowan urged his horse along the winding road toward Miller's Crossing. Morning mist drifted low across the fields, blurring fences, trees, and quiet farmhouses into ghostly shapes that disappeared almost as quickly as they appeared. He had traveled this road countless times while inspecting villages, settling disputes, and meeting merchants. Yet today, every mile carried a different weight. For the first time in years, he was not riding towards someone who expected him. He was riding towards someone who had finally stopped waiting. His horse slowed as the small crossroads came into view. A handful of supply wagons stood beneath towering maple trees, while drivers tightened harnesses and checked cargo before the long journey east. Travelers spoke softly to avoid disturbing the peaceful morning. Children wrapped in wool blankets watched birds gather near the creek. Nothing about the ordinary scene suggested that a single decision made during the night had quietly changed the course of two lives. Rowan dismounted without drawing attention to himself. Although everyone recognized their alpha king immediately, his expression discouraged formal greetings. He scanned every wagon, every cluster of passengers, every face. She was not there. A stable boy carrying feed recognized him and hurried over. "Good morning, Your Majesty." Rowan forced a calm smile. "Has a healer named Elara Bennett arrived?" The boy shook his head. "Not yet, sir. But the Haven Ridge driver keeps asking about her. They plan to leave at sunrise. Now they are waiting another half hour." Rowan thanked him and turned toward the largest wagon where an older woman carefully arranged crates filled with medical supplies. A silver badge identifying Haven Ridge Healing House rested upon her dark green cloak. She greeted him with respectful surprise. "Your Majesty." Rowan inclined his head. "You are expecting Elara Bennett." The woman smiled warmly. "Very much so. We have heard remarkable things about her for years. She finally accepted our invitation." Rowan hesitated before asking the question quietly. "Did she say why now?" The woman looked toward the empty road stretching back into the forest. "Only that she realized she could no longer postpone becoming the person she was meant to be." The words settled heavily inside him. She had not spoken about heartbreak. She had not blamed him. She had simply chosen herself. Before Rowan could answer, another traveler approached the wagon carrying a leather satchel. "Excuse me," the man said to the Haven Ridge healer. "Miss Bennett asked me to return this if she forgot it." Rowan recognized the satchel immediately. It was not one she had packed. The older healer accepted it and carefully opened the flap to identify its owner. Inside rested several folded treatment notes, dried herbs, and a small blue ribbon tied around a wooden token carved into the shape of a wolf. Rowan's breath caught. The older woman gently lifted the carving. "Beautiful craftsmanship," she murmured. "It must belong to someone important." Rowan looked away before she noticed the change in his expression. He had believed Elara left the carving behind because it no longer mattered. Instead, she had carried another one with her all along, smaller and worn smooth by years of being held. She had not walked away because she stopped loving him. She had walked away while still carrying memories she could not bear to throw away. That realization hurt far more than anger ever could. At that moment, another wagon driver called across the crossing. "The bridge ahead is flooded again. We cannot leave until the water drops or the county workers clear the fallen tree." Murmurs spread among the travelers. The Haven Ridge caravan would be delayed. Rowan instinctively glanced toward the forest road leading back toward the cottage. If Elara had been delayed packing or stopped to help someone along the way, she might still arrive. But another thought rose immediately behind the first. The old medical journal. His heart tightened. She had packed it. Yet something else surfaced in his memory. Her mother's wooden medicine chest had remained beside the fireplace the night before. It contained handwritten remedies collected across 3 generations. Elara would never willingly abandon it. Rowan slowly looked back toward the forest. If she realized what she had forgotten, there was only one place she would return before continuing east. Without another word, he mounted his horse once more. This time he did not ride because he believed he could stop her from leaving. He rode because somewhere between the silent cottage and this quiet crossroads he had begun to understand that if fate offered him one more meeting, it had to happen where everything had first been lost. Rowan urged his horse through the thinning morning mist, but unlike every journey he had ever made before, he was no longer chasing certainty. He was following the quiet hope that fate might grant him one final chance to become the man Elara had deserved years ago. The familiar trees welcomed him back to the forest surrounding the cottage. their leaves shimmering with droplets left behind by the night's rain. Every bend in the trail reminded him of another evening when he had ridden this same path, believing the hardest part of his day was finally over, never once asking what kind of day she had endured before opening her door with that gentle smile. He reached the clearing just as the first pale rays of sunrise slipped over the eastern hills. The cottage stood exactly as he had left it a few hours earlier, silent beneath the soft gray sky. He dismounted without haste, tying his horse to the old fence beside the herb garden. Then he noticed something he had completely overlooked during the night. Near the fireplace window sat a sturdy wooden medicine chest, its brass corners worn smooth by decades of careful use. He recognized it immediately. Elara had once told him it had belonged to her mother, and before that to her grandmother. Every remedy, every handwritten note, every pressed flower inside represented generations of healers who believed compassion should never be rushed. She would never leave without it. The realization settled quietly inside him. She would come back, not because of him, but because some parts of her life mattered too deeply to abandon. Rowan stepped onto the porch and reached instinctively toward the doorknob before stopping. The spare key rested inside his pocket. For years, he would have unlocked the door without thinking. Today, his hand slowly fell back to his side. He no longer had the right to enter simply because he possessed the key. Instead, he sat down on the top porch step, placing the small iron key beside him on the weathered wood. After a long moment, he removed the silver-crowned circlet that marked him as Alpha King. He looked at it quietly before setting it on the porch beside the key. It felt strangely lighter once it left his hands. The forest carried only birdsong and the distant murmur of flowing water. Time passed differently in the silence. Rowan found himself remembering details that had never seemed important before. Elara always greeted elderly neighbors before tending to palace patients. She always brewed extra tea because she believed unexpected visitors should never leave thirsty. She always listened until people finished speaking, even when she already understood the answer. Those habits had never demanded applause. They had simply become invisible through familiarity. He wondered how many invisible kindnesses he had mistaken for ordinary routine. Back at Miller's Crossing, the flooded bridge continued delaying the Haven Ridge caravan. The older healer decided to wait another hour before leaving, quietly trusting that Elara would arrive if she could. The courier who had carried her acceptance letter found himself watching the eastern road instead of preparing his wagon. Even old Mrs. Parker paused while gathering apples from her orchard, looking toward the distant forest with a thoughtful expression, sensing that something important had shifted without fully knowing why. Every path now pointed toward the little cottage. Every unfinished thread quietly drew itself back to the place where one light had once burned every evening without fail. Rowan remained seated on the porch as the morning sun climbed higher. He did not rehearse another apology. He did not prepare excuses about council meetings or royal obligations. Those explanations suddenly sounded like echoes from a man who had measured love by intentions instead of presence. If Elara returned, he would not ask her to understand him before he understood what he had done to her. If she chose to leave again after collecting the medicine chest, he would not stop her. That promise frightened him more than any battle he had ever faced because it demanded something no crown could provide. It demanded surrender. Then, carried gently through the quiet forest, came the unmistakable sound of approaching footsteps along the narrow trail beyond the trees. Rowan did not stand. He simply lifted his eyes toward the path, his heart beating with the steady rhythm of a man who finally understood that whether the next moment healed him or broke him forever would no longer be his decision to make. The footsteps grew louder until they emerged from the morning mist, steady but unhurried, carrying none of the uncertainty Rowan had imagined through the long hours of waiting. Elara appeared at the edge of the clearing with a small travel bag resting against one shoulder. Her hair was gathered beneath a simple scarf, and the soft gray cloak she wore still carried tiny drops of rain from the forest trail. She stopped the instant she saw him sitting on the porch. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them was not empty. It held 7 years of unfinished conversations, postponed evenings, forgotten promises, and quiet kindnesses that had gone unnoticed until they were gone. Rowan remained exactly where he was. He did not rise to close the distance between them. He did not reach for the key resting beside him. He did not place the silver circlet back upon his head. Instead, he slowly stood only long enough to step away from the doorway, leaving the entrance completely open before taking one step backward. It was the first invitation he had ever given without expecting anything in return. Elara looked from him to the wooden medicine chest resting beside the fireplace, visible through the open door. She understood immediately why he had stayed. Not to stop her, to make certain she could take what belonged to her. Without asking permission, she walked past him into the cottage. Rowan lowered his eyes. Instead of following, he heard only the quiet sounds of wooden drawers opening, glass bottles settling gently inside the old chest, and the soft rustle of folded pages as she checked that every handwritten remedy from her mother remained safely in place. Several long minutes passed before she stepped outside again, carrying the chest carefully in both hands. She set it beside her travel bag and finally met his eyes. They looked tired, not from the night's journey but from years of carrying hope that had slowly become heavier than either of them realized. Rowan swallowed before speaking. "I thought your waiting meant you would always be here." His voice remained calm, though every word felt heavier than the last. "I understand now that it was never something I had the right to expect." Elara listened without interrupting. He reached into his pocket and removed the spare iron key. Instead of holding it toward the cottage, he placed it gently into her hand and closed her fingers around it. "I should never have believed that carrying this meant I belonged here whenever I wished." He glanced briefly toward the silver circlet resting on the porch. "I spent years arriving only after everything else in my life was finished. I told myself that my intentions mattered because I always came eventually. I never asked how many evenings you spent wondering whether eventually would become never." His eyes lifted to hers again. "I confused your patience with permanence. I confused your kindness with certainty. I believed your light would always be waiting because I never imagined what it cost you to keep it burning." Elara felt the cool weight of the key resting in her palm. It had once represented trust, then habit. Now it represented choice. Rowan drew one slow breath before speaking the words he should have understood years earlier. "If you still wish to leave for Haven Ridge, I will not stop you. I will not close the roads. I will not ask anyone to bring you back. Your future is yours. Whether I am part of it should be your decision, not mine." For the first time since they met, there was nothing of the Alpha King in his voice. Only a man standing before the consequences of his own choices. Elara looked at him for a long moment before quietly answering. "I never wanted a crown, Rowan. I only wanted to stop wondering where I belonged in your life." Tears gathered in his eyes, but he did not step closer. He had finally learned that remorse was not permission. "I know," he whispered, "and I learned it far too late." She nodded gently, not with forgiveness, but with recognition that he had finally spoken the truth without defending himself. Then she lifted the medicine chest once more. "I am still going to Haven Ridge," she said softly. Rowan closed his eyes for a brief moment before opening them again with a quiet acceptance that surprised even him. "Then I hope they understand how fortunate they are." It was not the answer he wanted. It was the answer her freedom deserved. And because he loved her at last in the way he should have from the beginning, he let her keep walking toward the life she had finally chosen for herself. Elara reached Haven Ridge 3 days later beneath a clear autumn sky that carried the crisp scent of cedar and fresh rain. The healing house stood on a gentle hill overlooking quiet farmland, its wide front porch already filled with patients waiting patiently for the morning clinic to open. No one welcomed her as a legendary healer. No one treated her as the woman who had once lived beside an Alpha King. They simply smiled, introduced themselves, handed her an apron, and asked whether she preferred organizing medicines or seeing children first. For the first time in years, every decision belonged entirely to her. The freedom felt unfamiliar, almost fragile, but it also felt honest. She rented the small cottage Haven Ridge had promised, unpacked her mother's medicine chest, and placed it beside a sunny window where herbs could dry naturally. She left the wooden wolf inside the bottom drawer instead of displaying it on the shelf. Some memories still needed time before they could sit comfortably in the light. Back in Blackwood, Rowan refused every suggestion that the council send additional healers to replace Elara or quietly persuade her to return. When one advisor proposed offering her a royal title to encourage her home, Rowan shook his head before the sentence was finished. "If she returns because the palace became more attractive," he said calmly, "then I have learned nothing." Instead, He made smaller choices that no public announcement celebrated. Council meetings ended when he said they would end instead of stretching endlessly into the night. Promises written into his schedule remained unchanged even when easier excuses appeared. When villagers requested audiences, he listened until they finished speaking instead of rushing them toward quicker answers. At first, the palace staff noticed only little differences. Weeks later, they realized those little differences had become habits. Meanwhile, letters began traveling between Blackwood and Havenridge, but not the kind either of them might once have imagined. Rowan never wrote about missing her. He never begged forgiveness. His letters contained practical questions about new medicines, requests for advice when illness spread through isolated farms, and updates about patients she had once treated. Every letter ended exactly the same way. There is no need to answer unless you wish to. Sometimes Elara read them immediately. Sometimes they remained unopened for several days while she focused on families who depended upon her. When she did reply, her letters remained warm but careful. She answered every medical question thoroughly. She corrected Rowan whenever his understanding of an herb proved inaccurate. She occasionally asked about elderly neighbors from the forest or children she had once cared for. She never mentioned the morning they stood outside the cottage. Neither of them pretended that one conversation had erased 7 years. Winter arrived quietly. One snowy afternoon, a frightened father carried his young daughter into Havenridge after she developed a dangerous fever during the night. Elara worked beside 2 other healers for hours until the little girl's breathing finally steadied. Exhausted, she stepped outside just before sunset and found a familiar horse waiting near the fence. Rowan stood several yards away beside the road, holding a small basket of fresh rosemary and honey gathered from Blackwood. He did not approach the porch. He did not ask to come inside. He simply waited until she noticed him. "I heard the child recovered," he said with a gentle smile. Elara nodded. "She will be all right." He offered her the basket without crossing the distance between them. "Mrs. Parker insisted I bring these. She said the rosemary grew better after you planted it." Elara accepted the basket with quiet gratitude. They spoke for only a few minutes about harvests, medicines, and the coming snow before Rowan glanced toward the darkening road. "I promised the council I would return before dinner," he said. "They are expecting me." He smiled almost apologetically. "I intend to arrive when I said I would." Elara watched him mount his horse. There was no dramatic farewell, no desperate confession, and no request that she change her plans. He simply kept the promise he had just spoken. As she carried the basket inside, she realized something subtle but important had changed. For the first time since she had known him, Rowan had left not because she came second, but because he had finally learned that every promise, to every person, deserved to be honored. Spring returned quietly, almost unnoticed, until the hills around Havenridge turned green once more and the windows of Elara's little cottage filled with pots of fresh rosemary, lavender, and mint. Nearly a year had passed since she first unpacked her mother's medicine chest beside the sunny window. The clinic had grown busier with every season. Families traveled from neighboring towns because they trusted the calm healer who never hurried their stories and never made anyone feel like a burden. She had built a life that no longer waited for someone else to begin. Rowan had changed as well, though not in ways measured by royal proclamations. His council learned that when he promised a meeting at 9 in the morning, he arrived before the clock struck the hour. Villagers stopped saying the Alpha King was impossible to reach because he now listened before answering. Young officers noticed that he never expected loyalty he had not first earned himself. The changes were quiet, almost invisible from day to day, yet impossible to ignore across an entire year. Neither of them tried to erase what had happened. Instead, they allowed time to prove what words alone never could. Rowan visited Havenridge only when invited or when official business genuinely required the trip. Sometimes they shared tea after the clinic closed. Sometimes they simply walked through the gardens speaking about herbs, harvests, and ordinary moments that once would have been interrupted by another urgent responsibility. He never assumed she would make time for him. He asked. She decided. That difference slowly became the strongest foundation either of them had ever known. One warm evening in early May, Elara returned to the old forest cottage for the first time in many months. She had decided to reopen it one weekend each month as a small free clinic for nearby families who could not easily travel to Havenridge. The familiar room smelled faintly of cedar and dried flowers after a long afternoon spent cleaning shelves and opening windows. She placed her mother's medicine chest beside the fireplace once again, not because she had returned to her old life, but because she had chosen to give the little cottage a new purpose. As twilight settled over the clearing, she stepped onto the porch carrying a small lantern. She paused with her hand resting on the familiar iron hook where it had hung for so many years. Once, that light had meant she was waiting for someone who always arrived after everything else. Tonight it meant something entirely different. She lit the lantern because patients might still lose their way after sunset, and because she loved the warmth it brought to the quiet little home. The soft amber glow spread gently across the porch and into the surrounding woods. Several minutes later, distant hoofbeats echoed along the trail. Elara heard them and smiled, not because she had expected them, but because she knew exactly what would happen next. The horse stopped outside the gate. Rowan climbed down, straightened his coat, and walked slowly toward the porch. The spare key no longer rested in his pocket. He had returned it long ago and never asked for it again. Reaching the front door, he lifted one hand and knocked softly against the wood. He waited. No assumption, no certainty, only respect. Elara opened the door a moment later. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. Then Rowan glanced toward the glowing lantern and smiled with quiet understanding. "I almost thought I was late," he said gently. Elara looked at the light shining beside the doorway before meeting his eyes again. "You are right on time," she answered. She stepped aside, not because he expected the invitation, but because she freely offered it. Rowan entered only after she welcomed him inside. Behind them, the lantern continued glowing in the evening air, but it no longer promised that someone would wait forever. It simply illuminated the home of two people who had finally learned that love is not measured by how patiently one heart waits in the dark, but by whether the other chooses, again and again, to arrive when it truly matters.